I'm flesh and blood.
But here I am. I just flesh and blood and weakness.
Knowing there's a whole dynasty of his flesh and blood waiting to take over.
It's not flesh and blood, Gary.
Blood.
Will not countenance deceit, Lisa, against one of my own flesh and blood.
So isn't she worth as much to you in flesh and
Someone
blood?
of flesh and blood. As I've always said.
You're more flesh and blood.
Than your own flesh and blood.
You're nothing but a shadow on film. A shadow. You're not flesh and blood.
Like you're my own flesh and blood.
Those fucks will have to face their own flesh and blood.
Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
That's for you to see. I'm flesh and blood, but not human. I haven't been human.
Afraid you won't like what's underneath. But here I am. I just flesh and blood and weakness.
And I know that Big Daddy's just as proud as we are, knowing there's a whole dynasty of his flesh and blood waiting to take over.
Why, that's no way to talk.
What?
Why? It's two-dimensional on the screen. It's not flesh and blood, Gary.
Well, I know that, but, we can use it. Why? We can ask it.
You are flesh and blood.
Well, civilized society has no place for a masked man.
Mother, please. I will not countenance deceit, Lisa, against one of my own flesh and blood. But neither will I countenance any more of Charlotte's nonsense.
If she was powder, Mr. Christo, isn't she worth as much to you in flesh and blood?
I can't pay what I don't have.
Someone who knew where to dig. Someone of flesh and blood. As I've always said.
These are ravings.
Drink.
Still, you're more flesh and blood. So you remind.
I feel your characters matter more to you than your own flesh and blood.
Dignified profession. And what have you got to be so conceited about? You're nothing but a shadow on film. A shadow. You're not flesh and blood.
Oh, no.
Stop!
What could I do to you? I'm only a shadow.
I've been with you your whole life. Treated you like you're my own flesh and blood.
But I'm not your flesh and blood.
And they'll ask, is it true you did those horrible things? And those fucks will have to face their own flesh and blood.
Maybe. That's a kind of justice.
I think.
I've had it packed for a week now. Sometimes I think I'd prefer a rival of flesh and blood.
You're gonna need more.
I'll scarce believe that such a one as this, ever in flesh and blood, walked upon this earth.
Stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the...
Recently, it was perfected by my own flesh and blood. My family and I are...
I apologize.
You're only flesh and blood.
Striking a fellow officer.
It is a technique my father taught me. Always visualize your opponent as if he were flesh and blood before you.
It seems your father is to find so.
We're all just human. We're all flesh and blood. I'm reminded of the story of Simon Beck.
I've come here to tell them to wake up. This is flesh and blood. He has delivered a war here. And this...
My own flesh and blood, I can't deny her. No more than I can deny them boys.
Fears distraction. Can it be that our Mr. Stevens is flesh and blood after all and cannot trust himself?
You know what I'm doing, Miss Kenton?
Can't ask for better collateral than a man's own flesh and blood, right? Now you stay here, son.
Before you as one of my own family. As one dear to my heart as my own flesh and blood would be. He has been honorable to me and devoted.
Action, not allowing school prayer, and coddling of criminals.
I can't believe I'm having this conversation with my own son, with my flesh and blood. I can't believe it, unless some large Republican peapod.
These pharaohs who imagine they're living gods, they're nothing more than flesh and blood. I want to see them on their knees, begging.
My own flesh and blood.
Liam, I'm so sorry.
I want to know what happened.
I was never pretending. I love him, just like he was my own flesh and blood.
So do I. You do that once too often. It's only flesh and blood.
Michael George Hartley.
A stage. A stage is real. Real flesh and blood, human beings right out there in front of you, Buster. Can't look away, can't munch popcorn. That would be...
Lindsay, you're my own flesh and blood, and no, you made me proud.
Ask, in order to conquer the universe, is that you grant me flesh and blood.
Who love nothing, not Algerians or French or flesh and blood or anything living. So I have sympathy for a man who can...
Laid his brother low.
Them kids is yours?
My own flesh and blood.
Where's your missus?
She run.
And the life of your daughter? Your own flesh and blood?